for joining me on a quilting tale today. My name is Shaylin and I'm really excited about today's video because it's going to kick off a series of video tutorials about a quilt that I've been dreaming up for a while now. I was born and have lived in the Pacific Northwest all my life, and I've been thinking about a quilt that's inspired by the beauty that is the Pacific Northwest. And so what I want to do is create a row by row quilt. So it will be made up of several rows. Each will have a different element of the Pacific Northwest in it, and I also plan on making smaller filler rows to go between the main rows, which will be inspired by the ferries and lighthouses and different sea creatures that you find around here. Throughout this quilt, I plan on using not just traditional piecing, but also some embroidery and applique, maybe a couple applique techniques. So I'm really gonna push myself to test my skills here. Some of them are a lot stronger than others, but I want this to be a quilt where I grow, and I want you to come and see how I'm progressing with this. So there'll be a series of videos, like I said, one for each row that I'm doing. I have the sketches. I want to give you an idea of what's going to be in it, and then we will put the first row together. These are some of my sketches, and they're really rough, especially this one, so no judgments. But I just wanted to see if I could kind of create the fairy with blocks, and so you can see I have a really short crunched one. It needs to be longer, obviously, but I thought I could do a fairy front and a lighthouse. I plan on making some sailboats with some quilting block sails, maybe embroider, an applique, some salmon, crabs, starfish, sand dollars, and then I also wanted to get that orca whale in there because those are the jewel of the sea that everyone wants to see. This is a rough sketch of the Pacific Northwest quilt layout that I'm planning, so every time I release a new block, you'll see which one I'm working on. As far as fabric requirements for this quilt, I don't know the exact ones yet because, like I said, I'm going to be building this as I go and then putting it all together in a pattern when it's finished. But I have been collecting different fabrics, just kind of keeping the colors in mind. And so I have just the basic plain white fabric. I don't have many pre-cuts, but there were a couple. I found this one in a quilt shop a while ago. And I don't usually use batik fabrics, but I thought some of these looked so watery and like they could be under the sea that I thought they might work, or maybe make, you know, the sand dollars out of them. They have those kind of more natural tones to them. So this one is called White Noise, the Charm Pack by 5 Carat Jewels. This was another one I got a while ago called Netherlands, and it has the whales on it. It has the little fish in the seagrass. Let's see if I can separate it out. There's jellyfish. So this might be a background to something maybe when I make the quilt blocks in the sailboats, just to give it some whimsy. There's little sharks, and then there's the octopus. I might use it for that kind of thing. And then I was just thinking colors. I want the ground for the lighthouse to be brown, and then I have different shades of kind of purples and oranges to resemble the starfish around here. So most of the starfish in the Pacific Northwest kind of look like these colors, and they have just a little bit of texture to them. Nothing really that stands out as an object, but just different textures for interest. And so yeah, I have just different shades of purples and oranges. And then I got the solid orange here for the lighthouse. And then of course we need blues and greens. So Again, I got some that are just solid and then some that have a little texture to them. I thought this could look like water, and sometimes the water here does have a greenish blue tint to it. This one's the solid green that reminded me of the ferry boats, so that one is specifically for the boats. And then I just picked some blues that kind of have swirls and kind of a watery movement look to them. This one's really pretty. I thought it could be maybe a sky background. It just has almost like watercolor birds in the background there. And then just some more blues. I thought this could be the sky perhaps. This one has swirls in it. This could be sky or water in some of the blocks. Just some solid black fabric. This one again I got a while ago, another batik with jellyfish on it. This is part of that Netherlands collection. I just got more of it. This is a grunge. It's kind of a coneflower blue, but I just thought with the distressed darker marks it kind of can look like the water, because the water's not just a, you know, solid blue. This one I got a lot of. It's also part of Netherlands. These last two are just a gray and a darker blue. I liked them because it had the swirls in them. Again, that reminds me a bit of the currents or tides, or just movement of the water. And so again, I thought, you know, sometimes the sky here looks very gray, sometimes the water looks like a darker blue. So I just wanted to have lots of options. And some of these might not go in the blocks, but might be sashing or borders. So we'll just see how it comes together, but there's lots of options here to play with as I build this. I want to start this first one off. This is going to be the Washington State Ferry row, and I wanted to start with this one because these are going to be the biggest blocks, and I thought that would kind of set the tone for how wide the rest of the rows are going to be. The height, you know, can be different for each, but I really need to make sure that the width is going to end up the same for all my rows, and so I thought this is the one that is probably going to be the most challenging because it's a representational block, and I'm gonna try to recreate the ferry using rectangles and squares and triangles or half square triangles, and so I'll show you some of my sketches to see what I have in mind. So for this first block, it's going to be the longest block that determines the width of the main part of the quilt here. So we're going to be doing block number 1, and you can see that the next one will be block number 2, and it'll be 2 corner pieces here. And so you'll see some numbers, like there are lots of 8s here. That doesn't mean they'll all be identical, but will be done with a similar technique. Some might be identical, but just to give you an idea of what's coming up, looks like about 10 different videos I'm planning on doing here. So we'll go ahead and start talking about this first wide block here. That will be one row in and of itself. The next thing I want to talk about are the ferries, because that's what this one's going to focus on. So I found some pictures online with a side view of the ferry, and this is the one. I've been on this one here. It's another deck taller, and so as you can see with these highlighted lines, I kind of went over them in pencil and a ruler and segmented them into smaller rows. And the ferries are very long and not very tall. So I was measuring, this is about 7.5 inches long by 1 3/4 inches tall. So I was just trying to keep those proportions, and I was playing around with some. I might even go bigger than this as I just try out some things with this block. I'll show you what I end up deciding with. I won't film all of the trial and error. Just when I thought I had all the bugs worked out in this pattern and I was segmenting the pieces and figuring out the sizes for each cut and labeling them with the letters, my husband looked over my shoulder and said I wasn't going to say anything, but I think ferries are symmetrical on both sides and you can just design half of it and flip it. He's right, it's more efficient that way. I ended up just drawing it because it was too messy to try and copy one side on what I'd already colored. And so I do want this to be the most efficient and straightforward way. So one end is still slightly different just to get the measurements what I want them to be, but it's almost identical piecing on both sides. So I redrew it. I have it segmented by rows and how to put it all together now and all the sizes figured out for each piece. And so this is going to involve the traditional patchwork piecing mostly, but there is going to be some foundation paper piecing as well in here to get those more steep slopes in parts of the ferry. So I'll be making a template for the foundation paper piecing to fit with it as well. You'll want 5 different fabrics for this particular block. You're going to need black for the base of the ferry and the windows. You'll need green for the trim, white for the main body of the ferry, and then an ocean color and a sky color. So 5 different fabrics. And as I was trying to pick which ones I wanted, I thought this could also look really good as a sunset or nighttime ferry block as well. Ferries are really beautiful out at night when you see them on the water. It's just all black and then you see the yellow lights of the windows inside, and so I thought that might be an interesting way to do it, or kind of sunset themed with the sky being oranges and pinks and yellows. But I think just the blues and greens that I was planning on using will tie in best with this quilt, but a sunset or evening colorway might be another interesting take on this quilt if I were to try a second one. This is going to be 60 inches for this row, and that's the nice thing about the water and sky being on both ends, is I could give it a little more or less sky to get it to a width that I wanted. I thought 60 inches was good because it'll set the measurement for all my other rows. So this block will just be one row all by itself, and then I'll have rows made up of smaller blocks, and so 60 inches gives me different increments I could work with. I could do blocks of 10 inches, I could do 12 and 5-inch blocks, I could do some 30s and 20s and 10s and put them together. And so there's just a lot of flexibility because of the different factors that go into 60, or different ways I can, different sizes that will add up to 60 and still look nice. So let's go ahead and start cutting the pieces now. I'm excited to actually put this together and see how it looks. I've got all my little pieces cut, so now it's time to turn them into a 5-foot-long ferry boat. Alright, so the bottom row of this block is just going to be one long piece of ocean colored fabric, and so I'm actually going to start working on the second row because it's going to attach to that one. So I'm going to make 2 half square triangles. And so I'm going to first just draw a diagonal line on the lighter fabric, which is going to be my ocean fabric. So a diagonal line corner to corner, and then I'm going to put it right sides together with the black fabric. This is going to be the ferry boat base. And I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from that blue line that I just drew. I'm going to send my little bunny tail through first. And these are small enough squares that You don't really have to pin, but I'm gonna turn it around now and stitch a 1/4 inch from the other side. Okay, now I'm gonna cut it on the blue line. You can use a rotary cutter, or because this one is smaller, I'm just gonna use a pair of scissors and just cut on the blue line. So I have a 1/4 inch seam now, and then I'm going to press open toward the dark fabric and trim it down to the size that I need. I just realized my camera wasn't rolling after I already made the cut, so I'm just going to try and recreate it here. But I have my block, and I want to trim it down to a 2-inch half square triangle. So what I'm going to do is use the diagonal part of my ruler here, and I'm going to align it to the diagonal line of my half square triangle. When I align it, I want to go in 2 inches across and 2 inches up and down, so it's in the corner, and that the line on the ruler is aligned to the diagonal of the half square triangle. So my guard is on right now, but I just cut around the corner here and here, and that's when I realized my camera wasn't rolling. So once that's trimmed, I'm going to just turn it around now, and again line up in the corners so that it's 2 by 2, and I'm just going to clean up the edges here. And so now I have 2 of those. All right, so now you want to orient your blocks to be the edge of the boat. So on the left-hand side, you want the black portion on top and facing to the right. And then on the right-hand side, you're going to want the black portion on top, but to the left. And so we're going to attach a piece of the ocean to the outsides of those, because we're also going to have a long strip of black in between. That's going to make the base of the ferry. So we're just going to attach the outsides of the boat first. So it's going to, let's see if I can get that under there. So we're going to have one go together that looks like this. Alright, so I just pressed the seams to the ocean side just so it's less bulk, and now I'm going to take my really long black strip and put it between these two, and that will complete this second row. And just make sure, because this is such a long piece, that you keep track of the right sides, which is the right side and the wrong side, so you sew it together correctly. This piece will probably have a seam because it's so long. You'll need to connect 2 strips most likely, depending on how you cut your fabric. So I'm just attaching the black long strip to the bottom ocean row, and the bottom row just consists of one long piece of ocean fabric. And so you can pin if you'd like. I'm just aligning it every few inches or so, stopping to align, and I'm putting the skinnier black strip on top because it's just a little easier to control. Just make sure that you have your right sides together and really try for that 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because we're just assembling several rows, you can choose to press the seams up or down. one thing you want to be careful of when you're sewing these two pieces together is make sure your boat base is oriented in the right direction, and you really want to get those accurate 1/4 inch seams. There's going to be a lot of small pieces in this block, and so accuracy with your seam allowance will be critical. Now, rather than start the 3rd row, because there are so many identical windows in multiple rows on this block, I'm just going to assemble all the window pieces now. So if I counted correctly, there's going to be 46 of these windows, and so I'm going to be making a, let me put it on here, maybe it'll show up a little better than on a white desk. I'm going to be making 46 units that look like this. So I'm just going to chain stitch the top portion to the black, and then do the same thing with the bottom. Alright, so here's the first half, all 46 of them. So now I'm just going to go around. I'm not going to press them open yet. I'm just going to sew the other side on. And then once I'm done with that, I will cut them apart and press both sides toward the black darker fabric. Remember how I said this ferry was going to be symmetrical like a real ferry boat would be? There's one little difference on the left-hand side of the ferry. It has to do with getting the width of the block to be 60 inches. Like I said, that's kind of a friendlier measurement to build other smaller blocks off of. So I had to make a slight adjustment, meaning I'm going to have a couple kind of single windows instead of the longer ones like I just made a bunch of. So I'm going to make them the exact same way. They're just going to be about half the size. I'm going to make 2 of these single window pieces, and then we'll start to make the rows of windows. Something I wanted to point out with these solid color fabrics, sometimes it's hard to tell which is the right and wrong side. And just kind of as a general rule of thumb, if I can't tell with the naked eye which is which, it doesn't really matter. It'll come out and look fine. So don't stress too much if you can't figure out what the right side is, to put right sides together. When you're attaching the window pieces together, if you put the right sides together, you should be able to see the window through the white fabric on the bottom layer. And so I just like to make sure that my seams align, and you can kind of feel that they're aligned in there before you sew it. So I can see the window here and feel those are going to be straight and not crooked. Right, I just have been chain stitching the window pieces together, and so because they're not directional, you can flip them any way you need to connect to the next piece. So I think instead of attaching one window at a time, just chain stitch the segments and flip them around how you need to get them to connect. I have the first 3 bottom rows sewn together, but before I start attaching the window rows, I think it is a little easier to attach the window rows together first, because there's a lot of nesting that's going to happen here. So you can see on some I've pressed the seam allowances in toward the window, and then on this strip I've pressed them away from the window toward the vertical white strip. And so that's going to help them nest and make sure that they're aligned before putting them on the body of the boat. when you're getting ready to sew these longer strips, again, that's 60 inches long, it's a good idea to check your bobbin and make sure you have enough thread in there. If you don't think you have enough, maybe make some more window pieces or something that requires less thread, and then refill your bobbin before you get ready to do these long pieces. All right, let's go ahead and assemble the other rows now. For the foundation paper portion of this block, we'll be making some slanted fairy ends for row 7 and row 8. So I'm going to demonstrate on row 8 right now, but it's the exact same process for row 7. So first thing you're going to want to do is take the template, which will be part of the pattern that I type up here, and it just consists of 2 fabrics, so you'll need your sky fabric is number 1, and number 2 will be the white ferry boat fabric. When you print this out, there's a 1-inch mark there to make sure that your printer is scaled. It should be at 100% and print all right, but if it's too small or too large, you can enlarge or shrink what you print. But you're going to want to cut out both templates. There's the left side of the fairy and the right side of the fairy. Cut it out with your paper scissors along the dotted line. Make sure you don't cut the solid lines. That's going to be the part that's visible. Once it's all sewn into the block, the space between the solid and dotted line is your seam allowance space. So you might write on the back or somewhere on the template, you know, like this is the right one, but when you finish, you'll be able to tell when you put it up to your ferry boat. All right, so once your template is cut out, you're going to start with fabric 1, the sky fabric, and mine, it doesn't really matter because you can't tell which is the right and wrong side. But if you can, you'll want the wrong side facing up, and then you're going to put your template on top. So basically the back of the template, or the wrong side of the template, goes to the wrong side of the fabric. And so that's just for the first piece when you're foundation paper piecing. And then you can put a pin in it just to hold it in place, and what you're trying to do with piece number 1 is just make sure that all of the number 1 section, including the seam allowance around it, has fabric under it so that it's completely covered. Now if you were to just cut a piece of fabric to the shape of the template, you'd be fine and you'd have very little waste. Mine is just slightly bigger here, but that's okay. So once you've done that, the next step is going to be to fold along the diagonal line between 1 and 2. This is really the beginning steps of foundation paper piecing. If you had a third piece or more, which you often will, there's going to be additional steps that you won't see here, but because I'm only sewing 1 line, this is going to be a really simple one to do. So you can fold along that diagonal line, and you might use an index card or some thicker cardstock to help you with the line, but since it's small, I'm just kind of eyeballing it as it comes down, and then I'll fold a crease in there. And then with it still folded, I'm going to measure a 1/4 inch away from that folded paper. Let me show you from a different angle here. So I have my ruler lined up a 1/4 inch from the white fold, and I'm just going to cut off along the ruler here so I leave a seam allowance. Okay. So as you can see, there's very little waste when you start with the fabric being the same size as the template. So then from there, you're going to take a scrap of white fabric for the ferry boat. That's number 2. You can open the template back up. And you're going to want to line up your white fabric scrap so that the edge is along the edge you just cut with the sky fabric. You just want to make sure that when you fold it over, leaving that 1/4 inch seam allowance, it should completely cover all of section 2, which this one will, and then I'll have a little left over as well. So when I write the fabric sizes for these pieces, it'll be a generous piece because sometimes it's just off a little bit and you run short in a corner or something. So I just want to make sure you don't fall short. And then if you end up with a bigger piece, save it because you'll use it later on in this quilt. There'll be other smaller white pieces that you need. But we're going to go ahead and again line up along the edge here. And then I'm going to put a second pin in, and this time pin through all 3 layers here. So I'll catch the white fabric as well. And I want to make sure that stays all aligned. I'll take out my first pin. And so now we're going to sew. And when you're sewing, for foundation paper piecing, you should reduce your stitch length. Mine's normally set at 2.5, so I'm going to reduce it down to 1, so the stitches are really close together. That'll make it easier to tear the paper off later on. When you're sewing, you just want to go along that diagonal line, starting a 1/4 inch above it and ending a 1/4 inch past it. Let me show you from this angle. So I'm setting my needle up to be about a 1/4 inch above my diagonal line, and then I want that gap where my needle is going to go to be aligned with my diagonal line here, and also just about a 1/4 inch past it. And again, I want to make sure that my blue fabric is all aligned to the edge there. Alright, so let's go ahead and sew. So I just repinned to make sure that it all stayed aligned, and this time I did it in 2 places toward the top and bottom. So now I'm going to go ahead and stitch that line. Okay, and I went a 1/4 inch past. Alright, so once the line is sewn, we're going to spread this open so that the template is now on the bottom, spread open, not folded, and you'll have this piece here that you can press with your iron. So let me do that really quick. Okay, and so now you're ready to cut. So you're going to go around all 4 sides, just trimming right up to the dotted lines, which most of mine were cut to, but I want just real clean edges. So I'm going to go right to the dotted lines on each side. Make sure you don't trim the solid lines. Just clean it up. So there you have it. So this is going to be the left side of the ferry boat. And so to take the paper off, because we've already folded it and we use such small stitches, you should be able just to put your nail up right to the line. I like to start in the middle, and you don't even have to put a lot of pressure. I just pull gently and it comes right off. And then the second piece should just lift away like so. And so there's one side. And we're going to do the exact same process for the other. Remember, if you have larger scraps, save them for later on. You could even use them in row 7 for this step in this particular block, or in some future ones. But let's do it one more time. I'm going to speed it up this time. top and final row, I'm going to be making 2 of these, and it's going to be a smaller row combined with another thinner row to make the final row altogether. So let me explain. I'm going to be making the little lookout where the captain would pilot the boat, with the little window segments and the side pieces, but this time it'll be trimmed with the green roof. And then, so I'll combine all those. And then there's going to be a little bit more of the boat here in white with the sky trim, because it's not going to be quite as tall as the lookout tower. And then there's going to be a piece of sky in between. And so once these are sewn together, they will be the same height. And then there's going to be another piece of the boat with some of the sky here. And so there's going to be a centerpiece that I'm going to work on separately, and then this same section I just showed will be on the right side as well. Once those are all sewn together, I'll top it off with a larger sky piece that goes on top. So this is the kind of second part of this last row. So I'll have a sky piece, and then there'll be some side sky pieces as well. And again, I'll do the same on the reverse side. So I'm going to start sewing these together, and then we'll make the very center piece that will go between these 2 identical pieces. Here's the left side of the top of the boat with the little captain's quarters here and a little deck, and then these are just other parts of the ferry boat. I'm going to do the same thing now and piece the right side. It's just going to be flipped, and then I'll make the center piece that will go between these 2 pieces, which will be big smokestack of the ferry. So now we're ready to assemble the whole smokestack. So we're going to take the center unit here, make sure that the shorter white end is at the top, and then you have your 2 side pieces here, and those are going to get sewn on those foundation paper pieces we just did. So we'll attach those next. And then this, after that, it doesn't matter which order, you're just going to put the green border on the bottom, and you're going to put the blue sky on the top, and then this unit will be sewn into those larger side units that are part of row 8, and that will complete the row, and we'll attach it to the rest of the block. Alright, there's one key part I want to make sure I mention too when you're sewing the 2 pieces together, so you can barely see the white stitch line here. When I get onto the blue, I want to make sure that my line I'm sewing does not overlap or cross over the diagonal line, because that will make me lose my point, and I want this ferry the white part to run right up to the top. I'll show you when I turn it over. So here's the Ferry line, and I want it to meet, when I press this, right at the top. I don't want it to be cut short where there's extra blue up here or anything. So make sure that you don't overlap that line when you sew. Here's the finished block up on my design board. I'm really happy with how it turned out. I think it looks so much like the picture, and when you come in close, I like how you can see that texture in the water. You can see the lines that separate the different levels of the ferry. As far as piecing, probably the most difficult, because they were so small, are these little deck, the balcony pieces here. Because they're so small, I felt like they didn't get sewn as straight, so they get a little wider here and narrow here, and I did try taking them out after I noticed it a little late, and they were already sewn in with all these pieces. So trying to take it out and fix it, I felt like I was going to ruin those small pieces and fray them too much. So I just left them, but that's a good reminder though, if you make this yourself someday, just to really pay attention as you sew each piece before attaching the others. But I think it still looks wonderful, and I'm very happy with how it turned out and can't wait to see it with the rest of the blocks. This idea went from studying photographs to drawing a sketch to creating a block. So as you can see, this first row ended up being one long block instead of 3 like I had originally intended. As I played with the proportions and wanted to keep the ferry long and also shorter, it was just going to be too small of pieces to make a smaller block. So I ended up with one that was 60 inches long, which is going to set the width for the top of this quilt. And I hope you will continue watching as I develop more blocks for this quilt. I'd love to hear what you think of when you think Pacific Northwest. Maybe one of your ideas will get incorporated into this. Maybe you'll spark an idea in me that I hadn't considered. So please let me know what you think, and I hope you'll like and subscribe to keep following me on this new quilt journey. Thanks for watching.